Tonight on KQED Newsroom, former special counsel Robert Mueller's long-awaited Capitol Hill testimony and what it means for both parties ahead of the 2020 election. Also, a major housing project in San Bruno was rejected despite complying with city regulations, sparking questions about California's housing approval process. Plus, Facebook has nominated a chief privacy officer after being hit with a $5 billion fine by the Federal Trade Commission. Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Marisa Lagos. We begin our show with special counsel Robert Mueller's testimony to the House Judicial and Intelligence Committees on Wednesday. Mueller spent hours in front of the two congressional committees this week, sounding the alarm on Russian interference into our elections and pushing back against President Trump's insistence that the two-year investigation into the 2016 election was a witch hunt. But Mueller didn't give Democrats the game-changing moment they were looking for, further dimming the prospect of an impeachment push. And it remains unclear whether Republicans in Washington will do anything to combat what Mueller warned was an active threat from Russia. Joining me now to discuss this are Hoover Institution fellow Lonnie Chen and co-writer of Politico's California Playbook, Jeremy B. White. Thanks to you both.
Thank you.
So, Jeremy, it finally happened. We've been waiting for this for, it seems like forever. Mueller testified. What were your sort of broad impressions of these 6 hours of testimony?
You know, I think as everybody suspected going into this, his testimony kind of affirmed and solidified the positions of partisans on both sides. So Democrats came out of it saying Robert Mueller categorically stated that Donald Trump wasn't exonerated. There were some key moments in which he indicated that he would not have been able to charge a sitting president under Department of Justice policy, but that a president could be charged after he leaves office. For Republicans, they found more evidence that in their framing of it, that the Mueller report didn't produce any damning evidence against the president, and that this was sort of a last gasp Hail Mary attempt by Democrats to sort of make political hay out of this.
Yeah. Lonnie, do you agree? I mean, we did hear him say, I think that was a big moment, it was not a witch hunt. But mostly Mueller not only, stuck to the four corners of the report, but wouldn't even read from it, right? Yeah. Like, did anything surprise you?
Nothing surprised me. I mean, going into it, everyone figured that Robert Mueller was going to be a by-the-book kind of guy, and sure enough, he was very much by the four corners of the report, as you said. He didn't even want to speculate. In many cases, he didn't want to answer questions. I think what was interesting was how he appeared visually. I think Democrats would have liked to see a more robust presentation even of the facts, but that really wasn't Mueller. He was there to sort of be an unwilling witness in a lot of ways. And so I do think it reinforced a lot of people's impressions of the report, of the president, and of the political import of it.
Yeah. I mean, does this move the needle politically, do either of you think?
No, I don't think it moves the needle politically. I think the interesting thing, though, is in some ways it may have made Nancy Pelosi's life easier. Because, in fact, the pressure on her to proceed to impeachment proceedings right away, I think, has been lessened. And to a certain degree, I think that's probably for the best thing for the Democratic Party, for what she wants to do looking ahead to 2020. So I think in some ways it takes the pressure off of her. So that might be a good outcome for her. But in terms of it changing opinions and changing people's minds, I doubt it.
Right. I mean, as you said, Jeremy, it sort of confirms what people already think in their corners. But, I do think that there was a sense immediately after that impeachment is off the table, it's gone. It doesn't totally seem like that's the case now, right? We have seen a couple other representatives, including Mike Levin, one of the 8 who flipped a Republican seat in California, come out saying they're for it. Just on Friday, House Judiciary Chair Jerry Nadler did file, as promised, papers in court saying we want more information about the report, about the grand jury transcripts, saying impeachment is still under consideration. I guess, do you think there's any chance that Democrats are just kind of trying to slow walk this so it's closer to the election?
I mean, I would agree that the last few days seem to have sort of vindicated Nancy Pelosi's cautious approach. It doesn't seem like we're going to get any sort of real progress towards impeachment proceedings before the 2020 election. But as you noted, this is still very much an issue, not just for House Democrats, but for a lot of these frontline first-term members, including in California. You mentioned Mike Levin in San Diego has now become, I think, the 3rd California first-term Democrat to back impeachment. Katie Hill in Los Angeles. sort of got 95% of the way there. She said, I believe the president committed a crime. We want to wait and see if these subpoenas are honored before we pursue the strongest possible case. But even as Nancy Pelosi's sort of effort to tamp down the urgent launch impeachment hearings now drive has sort of been borne out by those hearings, it's clear that a lot of House Democrats are going to keep pushing.
I mean, Lonnie, is that the fact that you have these Democrats in these more purple districts who did just recently flip seats, does that tell you anything about how Democrats are thinking about this politically? I mean, I think that there is a narrative that for, folks in more moderate districts, it's a big risk, but we're seeing, at least in California, more of them want to at least keep it alive, the discussion alive.
Yeah, and California may not be representative of some of the other districts that turned in the rest of the country. I think in California, the sentiment, at least in favor of moving toward impeachment, may be much more favorable than you might find in other places. So I think the question really is, how does Nancy Pelosi, I mean, before I think the big question was, how does she arbitrate between the sides of her party, the one side who wants to pursue impeachment, the other side who doesn't? Now the question is, how does she sort of look going ahead to continue to satisfy people who want that while clearly not moving ahead with it, right? So she sort of said today, we'll do it when we do it, which basically means they won't. And so the interesting question will be, how does she satisfy those folks going forward who want impeachment?
Yeah, she also, I just saw, tweeted a picture of her with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Right. So I think trying to put out that narrative. We talk a lot about the political implications of this testimony, but at its heart, substantively, there were some really disturbing things in this report about Russian meddling, about their efforts to influence our elections, our democracy. Jeremy, do you see any move among Republicans in Washington to take those warnings that Mueller really laid out pretty clearly this week seriously? We haven't seen any legislation, for example.
I think Mitch McConnell has been pretty clear and adamant on this in terms of sort of pushing back on Democratic attempts to try to advance legislation to deal with some of these larger issues around campaign election security. But I think you're right that one of the truly notable moments from that hearing in which it wasn't something that was fully expected was when Robert Mueller said, I fear that this is the new normal, and sort of sent an unequivocal signal that we have a problem here. Yeah. And so whether Washington acts on that, I think I wouldn't put money on it, but to hear a law enforcement official at that level sort of so clearly state that democracy is facing some real peril, I think was one of the big takeaways from.
Yeah, and remarkable that we haven't seen any sort of bipartisan effort to deal with something that you would think everybody might agree is not a great thing. Well, on politics, back to politics. Next week, we will see the second round of Democratic presidential debates. Lanhee, do you expect that this report, that the impeachment proceedings, that Russian meddling will be part of that conversation at all?
I think it'll be a part of the conversation, but I think it's going to be a small part. I think by and large, the candidates at this point would love to be able to continue to define differences between one another. We're going to have a really interesting matchup when you've got Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders on the same debate stage. That's going to provide an opportunity to provide some clarity on the progressive side of this. And then we have sort of Kamala Harris, Joe Biden too, as it were, right? And so the opportunity for them maybe to talk about more issues from the 1970s. I don't know. But it'll be interesting to see how those two debates differ in terms of tenor and tone.
Yeah. I mean, Jeremy, we've seen for Kamala Harris, these debates are really the opportunity she needs. She did get a bump after the last one when she really attacked Joe Biden. That has waned a little bit. I mean, what are you watching for in terms of her specifically and that duo?
I think the fact that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden drew the same debate really sets up sort of a repeat clash that is going to be one of the most interesting dynamics in these debates. I'm curious to see if Kamala Harris is going to come at Joe Biden aggressively as she did the first time. Beyond that, I'm curious to see if Joe Biden seems like he has a plan. I think what was striking in that first debate was not just Kamala Harris's fairly commanding performance in that moment that really stuck in a lot of voters' minds when she confronted Joe Biden, but was how he seemed caught off guard by it.
By something he probably should have been prepared
by something that
for.
seems like, given some of the pushback he was facing for his comments about past work with segregationist senators and questions about his, long political record, yeah, it seems like something that his advisors maybe didn't prepare him adequately for, and so I'm curious to see not only if he seems better equipped to deal with what Kamala Harris throws at him, but also if he's ready to go on the offensive a little more. I think you've seen that with some of his comments in the last week, pushing back on Kamala Harris and Cory Booker. And so I'm curious to see if, in an effort to sort of shore up his front-runner status, he's not just defensive, but going on offense.
Yeah. Lanhee, final minute here. I mean, one of the things we did see Joe Biden do this week is roll out a criminal justice plan. As Jeremy mentioned, Cory Booker will be on that stage too. He pushed back on that. Do you think that that's a politically potent issue? I feel like for all three, Harris, Kamala, or Harris, Biden, and Booker, there's benefits, but also potential drawbacks to bringing up criminal justice.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple of obvious drawbacks. One being that it risks appearing as though the Democrats are debating a set of issues that many in America may not believe is front and center to what they will make their decisions in this campaign based on. In other words, they're not talking about the economy, right? So there's the danger of that, but you also have the danger of potentially looking like you're talking about something that's already happened, in the sense that the Trump administration and Democrats have worked together to do some criminal justice reform already, right? So you risk that as well. So we'll have to see, but my guess is that they're going to touch on many other issues, and there will be some flashpoint, but the pressure is definitely on Biden. There's no question about it.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Hoover's institution, Lonnie Chen, Politico's Jeremy B. White. Thank you guys both.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Earlier this month in San Bruno, the Mills Park Plaza development project, slated to provide over 400 units of housing near BART and Caltrain, was rejected by San Bruno City Council with a single no vote. This week, the San Francisco Chronicle reported that there were concerns over the building's size and increased traffic, even though the developer claims city guidelines were followed and requests from residents were incorporated. The failed project comes at a time when San Bruno is rapidly adding jobs with little housing to match, just one new home for about every 19 jobs between 2010 and 2015. Joining me now to discuss that and more are founder of A Livable City, Susan Kirsch, and columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle, Heather Knight. Thanks to you both for coming in. So I want to start with San Bruno, which echoes, I would say, some of the fights we've been seeing around the state and the Bay Area. This was a proposed 425-unit development in an area of the city that was recently rezoned for transit-oriented development. And the developer says he responded to community concerns over a 3-year period, spent $3 million on the development process, and did a lot of things. I mean, Susan, as somebody who works on these issues a lot, why do you think opposition remained?
Well, one, I can say watching the hearings that went on till almost 3 in the morning, it was a very painful process for everybody who was a part of that. And I think the reason the issues continue is because communities still feel like they are too often excluded early enough to be giving their input into the project, or when they're asked to pass measures like Measure N, the measure that was in San Bruno, the measure doesn't really disclose how big or how tall or how dense the projects will be. So there's those pieces. And then there's the issues of only getting a small amount of affordable, really affordable housing for projects that are as big as this project is.
This is 15%, 15%,
right?
And
yes.
Heather, I mean, that's fairly standard. We've seen in San Francisco, sometimes they want to go up to 18%. You know, developers say that they need to have market rate housing for this to pencil out. Does this track with what you've seen in San Francisco around these development fights?
Oh yeah, there's constantly fights from, seems like any neighborhood that San Francisco wants to add anything in, be it housing development, homeless shelter, what have you, there's pushback from the community. And there's a real feeling at City Hall that they're frustrated that this is so hard to get anything through because of the regulations, which allow pretty much one angry neighbor to really slow down projects.
I mean, Susan, how would you respond to that? Do you think there is anything you can really do in these cases to convince opponents, who live in an area that's largely been single-family homes? And we do need housing. I mean, I think that that's something most everyone can agree on.
Yes, absolutely. I think everybody agrees we need, but especially affordable housing. Mm-hmm. Not so much agreement that we need market rate housing. But to many people, Marty Medina, the man who voted no, is viewed as someone who is standing up for the wishes of the community and saying yes to a lot of things that many of us want to preserve in our own communities, that he was saying yes to not making traffic worse. And a part of that is that this was a project that included a 40,000 square foot grocery store, even though there are many other grocery stores that are already in the area. And that grocery store was anticipated to add 65% of the additional traffic that would be coming into that project. So that didn't make sense. He was standing up for community concerns about that.
That's interesting. I had understood that was something that they had added in as a response to community concerns. But without getting into just every detail of this one project, I mean, Heather, traffic is always an issue. I mean, the character of neighborhoods, this is something we hear on the west side of San Francisco quite a bit. I don't know that there's a way to add the amount of housing California says it needs without these kinds of issues changing neighborhoods. Is that fair?
Right. I believe California is 3.5 million housing units short of what it would take to actually house everybody here and expect it to come here because of new jobs that are being created all of the time. It's half of the shortage of the entire country. So obviously, communities have to accept more housing into their neighborhoods, including single-family residential neighborhoods, which are resisting these kinds of developments in really big numbers, it seems like.
Yeah, and can we get into that a little bit? I know in San Francisco there's a push to sort of create more of a citywide, that it would affect everybody, right? I think what we've seen a lot in San Francisco, for example, is a lot of building in one particular or a couple particular neighborhoods where there was a perception that it was more acceptable to have more high-rise, more dense housing. How are neighbors in, say, the west side of San Francisco responding to that? And is there any effort by the elected officials to try to bridge some of these gaps we're talking about?
Yeah, I wrote this week about a new proposal from Tipping Point, the anti-poverty nonprofit, to secure 1,100 new units all over the city. They want 100 units in each district. We have 11 supervisor districts, and they want 100 new ones in each, which is not that big, not that many compared to how many people live in San Francisco. But they are expecting a pushback, and they are calling on neighbors who are open to these kinds of new developments to stand up and sign a pledge and say, I'm cool with more people coming into my neighborhood, because they want those voices to be raised as well.
I mean, Susan, do you think that in some cases a vocal minority are the ones killing these projects? I mean, because we do hear, I think people who are opposed to these sometimes have a bigger incentive to come out.
Well, I think what we have is power on the side of doing a lot of the development, which is not reaching out to what is going on within the communities, and that what we need is more of the understanding of what's causing the problem. So even that number of how many housing units we need, I understand that's based on the projections of how many jobs there are going to be coming into the area. So maybe that's a basic element that we need to look at again as to how many jobs do we want coming into our communities, and should we be making some adjustments about the jobs so that the jobs all concentrated within these same high value areas are getting dispersed more broadly.
Heather, one way that this problem with affordability in housing has really become visible in the Bay Area is around homelessness. And we saw some recent counts come out, some pretty staggering numbers. Can you tell us what we know about how we're doing with the homeless problem here?
Right. Those new numbers just came out in the past couple of months and have been shocking up and down the state. Pretty much every county in California saw a dramatic increase in the number of homeless people counted. This happens every other January on one night. People go out and count homeless people in every county. It's required by the federal government for homeless dollars. For years, San Francisco had held steady. This was the first time we ever saw a big jump, and it was 30% in 2 years, which is just astounding. City Hall was shocked because they've been spending so much money, putting in so much effort on this subject, and we totally went backwards, so it was pretty devastating.
Susan, your group has worked to elect candidates that maybe some people would say are anti-growth, you might say more slow growth, at the local level. And we've seen a lot of debate in Sacramento around sort of trying to have the state come in and force cities to do more. Are you worried at all that by continuing to elect these types of folks that you could actually spur more of what you don't like to see in Sacramento?
I'm not worried about that at all. In fact, I think we need more of that. We need more of the local community voice coming out strongly, because at the local level, communities have done a great deal of work following state-required housing elements within the general plans, and that they've got a lot of plans within the housing elements that are showing ways to solve the housing problem. I mean, too often the narrative is that cities are to blame because they're not building enough housing, but actually it goes back to knowing cities don't build housing. They allow for a certain number of housing units, but the developers have to pull the building permits, and then the builders have to build using those building permits. So cities, in my opinion, are being unfairly blamed for that. And in Sacramento, they're taking a very simplistic look at the problem, saying cities are to blame, we should curtail their power. And what would benefit everybody is if there was a much more collaborative kind of dialogue going on to reap some of the wisdom that has already gone into solving this problem.
Heather, you might have a slightly different perspective. I mean, what do you think needs to happen, and would you welcome state intervention in some of these communities?
I think because we've seen so many communities not rise to the occasion that yes, state involvement is certainly necessary, including in San Francisco perhaps. I think that we need to not just be worried about what our neighborhoods look like now and how long we sit in traffic, but think about where our children are going to live, where our grandchildren are going to live. This problem is going to get worse and worse if we don't start dealing with it in a significant way.
You agree?
Well, I think that's where San Bruno is a great example. Is what they've looked at is how much they're already sitting in traffic, and that to go forward with that project would have made that so much worse immediately. So maybe what we need is more traffic, more solutions coming from the traffic end of
Maybe
it.
more transit.
More transit.
We're going to have to leave it there. Susan Kirsch with the Louisville, California, Heather Knight with the Chronicle. Thank you guys both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On Wednesday, Facebook agreed to pay $5 billion in a settlement with the Federal Trade Commission over the tech giant's role in the Cambridge Analytica scandal. At a press conference, FTC Chairman Joe Simon said, quote, Facebook betrayed the trust of its users and deceived them about their ability to control their personal information. Part of the FTC agreement requires that Facebook institute an independent privacy committee while understanding that false certification will subject them to individual civil and criminal penalties. On the same day, Facebook reported $16 billion in revenue for the second quarter, a 28% increase from the same period a year ago. Joining me now is San Francisco Bureau Chief Jeremy Owens from MarketWatch. Thanks for being here, Jeremy.
Thanks for having me, Marisa.
So let's back up a little and talk about this fine and settlement and this Cambridge Analytica scandal, which seems kind of far away at this point. What was that all about, and why did that cause so much outrage?
Well, basically the data that was involved in this scandal was taken through a quiz app, and it involved a lot of data that Facebook does not allow these types of apps to take anymore, right? But that was then sold to a political consultancy called Cambridge Analytica, which used it, they think, for Brexit and Trump's election and things like that to target users. Now, Facebook claims that it has changed its rules. It does not allow that type of data to be taken anymore. It asked for that data specifically to be destroyed and was told it was, right? But at this point, Facebook has faced so many issues that it realizes that was a problematic thing and that it's just going to accept the fine and move on.
And then there's this new committee. There's, Mark Zuckerberg could be held personally responsible financially if they do violate this settlement.
Or criminally, yes.
And do you think this is going to really change things? I mean, should users feel better?
I don't know, right? If you look at a lot of problems that we have in this country, the answer is usually a new blue ribbon panel or commission, right? How much better does that really make you feel? This is a board committee that's going to look at it. There will be an independent person within Facebook looking at privacy, reporting to that board committee and not Zuckerberg. Zuckerberg will get informed about what they found for that quarter, basically, and will have to sign off on it, right? So it's just more red tape that they have to go through. So if that makes you feel better, sure. I don't know if it makes me feel better. Okay. I would hope that the $5 billion and the chance of criminal charges against Mark Zuckerberg specifically will make them think twice about everything they do at that company.
But as we noted, they posted nearly $17 billion in revenue, over $2.5 billion in profits this quarter. I mean, does this...
And that's after the fine, which was $3 billion. They took $3 billion off. They actually had more than $5 and almost $6 billion in profits.
So does this do anything to force them to change or to send a message to other companies? I mean, what's the real goal here of a fine like this?
Well, it is to scare other companies and to let them know that this does happen. And it just shows that they are going to step up, right? There was a 2012 FTC fine that this relates to, right? And so Facebook was dinged for privacy in 2012, and they said, if you do it again, we're going bigger. Well, this is going bigger, right? And now...
It still seems like a drop in the bucket for a company.
Well, $5 billion is a lot of money. Don't get me wrong. It's just when you look at it from Facebook, that's about a quarter's worth of profit for their annual profit, right? That's still, I mean, if you take away a quarter's worth of a company's profit for a year, that's going to sting.
Got it.
Right? It's just not going to have that much of a long-lasting effect, right? But Facebook will always continue to do well as long as advertisers are coming there. And Facebook offers something that nobody else has, and that's billions of users and really in-depth data on those users to target them. Nobody else can really say that, so advertisers aren't going to go anywhere else.
Well, speaking of, we've been hearing a lot about antitrust inquiries from the federal government, not just into Facebook, but into some of the other big tech giants. And one of those is a DOJ, Department of Justice antitrust inquiry that's going to look a little more broadly at this. We just heard about this week. What are the feds looking at? And is this political posturing, or are we talking about actual, I don't know, heat again on these companies?
We're really going to have to wait and see. Basically, the Justice Department said publicly this week that they are looking at all of big tech, basically. They specifically called out social media, commerce, and search, which means Google,
Amazon.
Facebook, and Amazon. They also had some language in there that could include Apple, right? So this is separate from what we believe to be 4 individual antitrust investigations into those 4 companies: Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Alphabet, which is Google's parent company. But this is a much broader look, which, it will have to see. There are 2 possibilities here. One is that it is totally political, right? The Democratic candidates have come out and gone very hard at big tech. And so the administration is saying, look, we need to show that we're hard on big tech too, right? That's a possibility. The other possibility is this is the smart way to go about it, right? We have said a lot of times, none of these companies specifically are a monopoly. Right? Together, they are what's called an oligopoly, right? This is all of big tech. Apple does not control the smartphone market. Android, Google, does not control the smartphone market. Combined, they control the smartphone market. So all of big tech kind of controls tech in a way. So if you're going to look at, are these companies using their power in a way that is going to hurt competition, that's going to hurt other companies, I don't know if you can look at just Apple and just Amazon and just Facebook. You need to look at the entire tech ecosystem. And that seems like what the Justice Department could be doing. Or they could just be making a political play.
All right, quickly, we don't have a ton of time, but another issue we saw kind of bubble up this week was around some of these food delivery services. DoorDash is one of them, which said this week they're going to stop using tips to round out salaries of these contract workers. Pretty appalling that they were doing that. There was a lot of public outcry. I guess I wonder if you think that this is going to give any sort of fuel to the move we're seeing at the state legislature to create some legislation to get around this issue of contractors versus employees. I don't know. Is this going to move the needle?
I don't know. I mean, that is an issue that we have faced for years now, and we continue to hit these small controversies along the way, right?
And it almost feels like you need that outcry.
Right. You need that public outcry. I mean, we saw DoorDash go back and say we're not going to do this anymore. Instacart already had done that. Like they had done the same thing and already had an outcry and changed. Now there are other companies that are still doing it, right? We believe that maybe Amazon's delivery of Whole Foods is doing the same thing. So I think the public outcry is going to end up having more of an effect individually than we're going to see from the legislature having collectively.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Jeremy Owens from MarketWatch, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And that'll do it for us. As always, you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Marisa Lagos. Thanks for joining us.